Welcome to Café Tales. In this story, we visit Little Worthy, a village still waking from the spell of Halloween night. What should have been a simple pumpkin-picking tradition soon turns to shock as Miss Marple stumbles upon something far more chilling than autumn frost. If you enjoy this story, please give it a like and share it with fellow mystery lovers. Before we begin, tell me where you're tuning in from. I always read your comments and truly enjoy hearing from you. Now, as always, grab a coffee, stay curious, and let's get started. The Pumpkin Patch Murder Chapter 1. All Hallows Morning. The mist lay thick over the village of Little Worthy on the morning of the 1st of November. It was the sort of mist that comes after a clear, cold Halloween night, white and clinging, softening the edges of hedges and making the few remaining leaves on the chestnut trees glisten with moisture. Miss Marple, taking her customary morning constitutional, found the air pleasantly bracing despite the damp. At her age, she reflected, one appreciated the milder days of autumn before the true cold of winter set in. She had come to Little Worthy at the invitation of her goddaughter, Miss Lavinia Gray, who had written with such insistence that Miss Marple felt it would be unkind to refuse. Lavinia was a sensible woman of 45, unmarried like herself, and possessed of a comfortable independence that allowed her to live quietly in a charming cottage on the outskirts of the village. The visit had been pleasant thus far. 3 days of gentle conversation, modest meals, and the sort of companionable silence that exists between old friends. This morning, however, Lavinia had awakened with a slight headache and had elected to remain in bed a little longer. Miss Marple, never one to waste a fine morning, had set out alone with her walking stick and a general intention of exploring the village properly. She had just reached the small village green when she encountered Mrs. Dorothy Prescott, a woman of perhaps 50, with the sort of energetic manner that suggested a life devoted to committees and good works. Miss Marple had been introduced to her the previous afternoon at the vicarage tea. Miss Marple, how fortunate! Mrs. Prescott advanced with purposeful strides, her sensible shoes making crisp sounds on the damp pavement. I was just thinking how we might need another pair of hands this morning. You did say you were interested in village activities, did you not? Miss Marple, who had said nothing of the sort but had merely listened politely to Mrs. Prescott's enthusiastic descriptions of various parish endeavors, murmured something noncommittal. It is the pumpkin picking. You see, Mrs. Prescott continued, hardly pausing for breath, at Hartley Farm, Mr. Hartley Hazelways allowed the village children to come and select pumpkins after Halloween. A charming tradition, though I cannot say he enters into the spirit of the thing with quite the same enthusiasm as the previous owners. There was something in Mrs. Prescott's tone that suggested certain reservations about Mr. Hartley. Miss Marple, whose hearing was excellent despite her years, caught the slight emphasis and filed it away with interest. I am to supervise the children. You understand, Mrs. Prescott went on. Usually there would be 2 or 3 of us. But Mrs. Henderson has a cold, and Miss Porter has gone to visit her sister in Exeter. I thought perhaps if you were not otherwise engaged, I should be happy to accompany you, said Miss Marple. The prospect of observing village life was always interesting, particularly when it involved a newcomer who apparently did not enter into the spirit of local traditions. They set off together along the lane that led toward the edge of the village. Mrs. Prescott maintained a steady stream of conversation, most of it concerned with the organization of the pumpkin picking and the anticipated behavior of various village children. Miss Marple listened with apparent attention, though her eyes were busy taking in the details of the countryside around them. Mr. Hartley bought the place from the Durwoods, said Mrs. Prescott, apparently following some train of thought of her own. The Durwoods had been here for generations, but there were financial difficulties. Such a sad business. James Durwood took it very hard, I'm afraid. Miss Marple made a gentle sound of sympathy. There was some unpleasantness, Mrs. Prescott added in a lower voice. though there was no one within hearing distance. Mr. Durwood said certain things at the public house about Mr. Hartley. Nothing actionable, you understand, but, well, feelings ran rather high. They had reached the gate to the farmyard now. It stood open, which seemed odd at such an early hour. The farmhouse itself showed no signs of life, the windows blank and unrevealing in the gray morning light. "We are perhaps a trifle early," said Miss Marple, consulting the small watch pinned to her coat. "It's only just 7 o'clock." "Oh, but Mr. Hartley was always an early riser," said Mrs. Prescott. "I understood we were to come at 7. He was most particular about it. The children are to arrive at 1:30, you see, and he wanted us here beforehand to make arrangements." They proceeded through the gate and along the path that led around the side of the house. The pumpkin patch, Mrs. Prescott explained, lay beyond the kitchen garden. It was quite extensive, Mr. Hartley having taken considerable pride in the size and quality of his pumpkins. As they rounded the corner of a large barn, the pumpkin patch came into view. It was indeed extensive, perhaps 1/2 acre of flattened vines and orange globes of varying sizes. The mist hung particularly thick here close to the ground, giving the scene an oddly theatrical quality, and then Miss Marple saw it. At first she thought it was merely part of the Halloween decorations, a scarecrow perhaps, left standing among the pumpkins. But something about the angle was wrong, and as they drew closer, the horrible truth became apparent. A man lay face down among the pumpkin vines. Standing over him, positioned with grotesque deliberation, was the farm's scarecrow, its ragged arms spread wide as though in benediction or accusation. A spade lay nearby, its blade catching what little light penetrated the mist. The scarecrow itself was a curious creation, not the usual hastily assembled bundle of straw and old clothes, but a carefully constructed figure with an almost human aspect to its posture. Someone had taken considerable trouble over its construction, Miss Marple noted, as though it represented more than the usual deterrent to birds. There was something accusatory in its stance, something watchful in the angle of its burlap head. Mrs. Prescott's scream shattered the morning silence. It was a sound of pure shock, high and piercing, and it brought an instant response from the farmhouse. A window was flung open, and a woman's voice called out something Miss Marple could not quite catch. But Miss Marple herself did not scream. She stood very still, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her, the position of the body, the theatrical arrangement of the scarecrow, the spade lying just so, and something else, something about the ground around the body, about the way the frost-touched earth looked in the gray morning light. It reminded her, she thought, of something that had happened years ago in St. Mary Mead, something to do with a garden accident that had not, upon closer examination, been an accident at all. Mrs. Prescott was still screaming, and now there were sounds of running footsteps from the direction of the farmhouse. Miss Marple moved forward slightly, careful not to disturb anything, her eyes never leaving the scene before her. The village of Little Worthy, she reflected, was about to experience rather more excitement than its inhabitants had bargained for. Chapter 2. Village Whispers. By mid-afternoon, the news of Thomas Hartley's death had spread through Little Worthy with the swift efficiency that only English village gossip can achieve. Miss Marple, seated in her goddaughter's comfortable drawing-room with a cup of tea at her elbow, reflected that murder had a way of stripping away pretense, revealing the true character of a community, just as frost reveals the hidden structure of a leaf. "The police have been most thorough," said Lavinia, pouring a second cup. "Inspector Morton has come from Melchester. They say he's terribly clever, though I understand he can be rather brusque." Miss Marple nodded. In her experience, the cleverness of police inspectors varied considerably, but their brusqueness was a near constant. And the poor man was found by you and Mrs. Prescott. How dreadful for you. Aunt Jane, Lavinia continued, passing a plate of scones. Mrs. Prescott is quite prostrate. I hear Dr. Creswell has given her something to help her sleep. It was certainly a most unpleasant discovery, Miss Marple agreed mildly. Though I must say that Mrs. Prescott's reaction, while perfectly natural, did make it rather difficult to observe. The details of the scene before it was disturbed. Lavinia looked faintly shocked, as people often did, when Miss Marple displayed her practical approach to murder. Before she could respond, however, the doorbell rang with an imperious peal. The caller proved to be Mrs. Maud Henderson, recovered sufficiently from her cold to venture forth in pursuit of information. She was a substantial woman with a formidable hat secured by 2 long hat pins that gave the impression of antennae quivering for news. Miss Gray and Miss Marple. How fortunate, Mrs. Henderson exclaimed, settling her considerable bulk into Lavinia's beast armchair without waiting for an invitation. I came the moment I heard. To think that you were there, Miss Marple. How perfectly dreadful, and yet how fascinating. You must tell me everything. I'm afraid there isn't much to tell, said Miss Marple. It was all most distressing, of course. Mrs. Henderson was not to be deterred by such modest disclaimers. They say the poor man's head was quite bashed in, and that the scarecrow of all things, was placed over him in a most peculiar manner, and with a garden spade. Is it true that James Durwood's initials were carved on the handle? Everyone is saying so. I really couldn't say, replied Miss Marple, though in fact she had noticed the crude J.D. cut into the wooden handle. The police will no doubt examine everything most carefully. Well, it hardly needs a detective, does it? Mrs. Henderson leaned forward confidently. When a man publicly threatens another man in the Crown and Feathers, and then that very man is found murdered with a tool bearing the first man's initials. Well, I was not born yesterday, Miss Marple. I'm sure you weren't, Mrs. Henderson, said Miss Marple with perfect gravity. Threatened him? Inquired Lavinia, unable to resist. Mr. Durwood threatened Mr. Hartley. Mrs. Henderson nodded with satisfaction at having secured her audience's attention. 6 weeks ago, it was after the Harvest Festival. James Durwood had taken more ale than was perhaps wise, and he stood up in the public bar and said, quite loudly, I understand, though naturally I was not present myself, that Thomas Hartley would live to regret the day he'd ever set eyes on Durwood Farm. How very uncomfortable, murmured Lavinia. There was more. Mrs. Henderson continued with relish. He said, and I have this from Mrs. Simmons, whose husband was there, I built that farm, and my father before me, and his father before him. That land knows Durwoods, and it won't tolerate a stranger for long. Most sinister, don't you think? Miss Marple inclined her head noncommittally and reached for her knitting. The pale blue wool of a baby's matinee jacket grew steadily beneath her nimble fingers as Mrs. Henderson expanded upon the May village's reaction to the morning's events. It seemed that opinion was sharply divided. There were those who had found Thomas Hartley to be a perfectly agreeable neighbor, if somewhat reserved. Others, however, spoke darkly of his business methods and his apparent lack of interest in village affairs. There was also, Miss Marple gathered, a certain sympathy for Emily Hartley, who was described variously as that poor young woman, and much too pretty for him, though Dr. Creswell has been most attentive, added Mrs. Henderson with significant emphasis. Most attentive indeed. The implications behind this statement hung in the air until the doorbell rang again, this time announcing the arrival of Inspector Gerald Morton. He was a tall, lean man of about 45, with iron-gray hair and the sort of face that seems perpetually dissatisfied. His keen eyes took in the scene with a sweeping glance before settling on Miss Marple. Miss Jane Marple? He inquired. I understand you were present when the body was discovered. Yes, indeed, said Miss Marple, setting aside her knitting and regarding the inspector with interest. Mrs. Henderson rose reluctantly, making it clear that only the most rigid adherence to propriety prevented her from remaining to witness the interview. Once she had been shown, out with assurances from Lavinia that she would be kept informed of developments, Inspector Morton took the vacated armchair and removed a notebook from his pocket. I'd be grateful for your impressions of the scene. Miss Marple, he said, before the body was disturbed. Certainly. Inspector, said Miss Marple, though I'm just a foolish old woman, and I dare say I notice nothing of importance. Inspector Morton's lips twitched. I've been warned about you, Miss Marple. Sir Henry Clithering speaks most highly of your observational skills. Miss Marple blushed faintly. How kind of him. But really there was so little time before everything became rather confused. Nevertheless, she proceeded to describe in precise detail the position of the body, the arrangement of the scarecrow, the location of the spade, and the condition of the ground around the corpse. The inspector's eyebrows rose increasingly as she spoke, and his pencil moved rapidly across the pages of his notebook. Most helpful, he said when she had finished. The pathologist believes Mr. Hartley was killed between 9 and 11 last night. The weapon was indeed the spade found at the scene, which does appear to bear the initials J.D. carved into the handle. Fingerprints have been found on it, some belonging to the victim. Interestingly enough, Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily before resuming their steady click. How curious! Though I suppose Mr. Hartley would naturally use his own garden tools. Inspector Morton's sharp glance suggested that he found her comment worthy of consideration. He rose to leave, thanking both ladies for their assistance. One last question, Miss Marple, he said at the door. You mentioned something reminded you of a case in St. Mary Mead, was it? What exactly struck you as familiar? Miss Marple smiled gently. Oh, nothing specific, Inspector. Just something about the general arrangement. But I'm sure it's not important. Chapter 3. The Former Owner. The following morning dawned with a clarity that had been absent the day before. The mist had retreated, leaving behind a crisp autumn day that showed Little Worthy at its most picturesque. Miss Marple, who had slept surprisingly well despite the previous day's events, suggested to her goddaughter that they might walk to the village shop for the morning paper. I should like to see how the village is responding, she remarked mildly. One learns so much from people's reactions to sudden death. It reveals character in the most remarkable way. Lavinia, who had grown accustomed to her godmother's somewhat unconventional observations, merely nodded and reached for her coat. The small shop that served as the village's post office, general store, and unofficial center for gossip was unusually crowded. Mrs. Bartlett, the postmistress, presided over the scene, with the air of one dispensing not merely stamps and tea, but information of the highest value. Good morning, Miss Gray, Miss Marple. Mrs. Bartlett inclined her head with a gravity that acknowledged their connection to recent events. Terrible business, this. Quite shocking for our little community. Indeed, said Lavinia, selecting a newspaper. Miss Marple lingered by a display of knitting wool, her head tilted at an angle that suggested absorption in the merits of different yarns. In reality, she was listening intently to the conversation taking place at the counter. They've taken him in for questioning. You know, Mrs. Bartlett was saying to Mrs. Wilson. The doctor's housekeeper, James Durwood. Constable Rogers went to fetch him first thing. Well, it was only to be expected, replied Mrs. Wilson, with the satisfied air of one whose predictions have been fulfilled. What with the threats and all, and his initials on the garden spade, as if he'd planned it all along. It seems almost too obvious, ventured a quiet voice from the corner. Miss Marple turned to see a thin, scholarly man whom she recognized from the vicarage tea as the curate, Mr. Fletcher. "Too obvious indeed," exclaimed Mrs. Bartlett. "Why, James Durwood's never had a devious thought in his life. Hot-tempered, yes, but straightforward as they come. If he'd wanted to do away with Mr. Hartley, he'd have confronted him directly, not skulked about in pumpkin patches on Halloween night." This forthright defense was met with thoughtful murmurs. Miss Marple selected a ball of pale blue wool and made her way to the counter, her expression one of gentle inquiry. "I wonder," she said, "if I might trouble you for directions to the vicarage. My goddaughter tells me there's to be a meeting about the church bazaar this afternoon, and I thought I might make myself useful." The resulting directions were comprehensive enough to guide a foreigner through the most complex of terrain, though the vicarage was in fact visible from the shop's front door. Miss Marple listened with apparent gratitude, noting that the conversation had now turned to Emily Hartley and her reaction to her husband's death. "Taking it very calmly, from what I hear," said Mrs. Wilson in significant tones. "Dr. Creswell says she's bearing up remarkably well for someone who's just been widowed." "And I dare say Dr. Creswell would know," remarked Mrs. Bartlett with equal significance. As they left the shop, Lavinia sighed. "Village tongues, so quick to judge and so reluctant to forget. And yet occasionally quite accurate in their observations," replied Miss Marple thoughtfully. "People do reveal themselves, you know, in the most unexpected ways." They had just reached the lich gate of the church when they encountered James Durwood himself emerging from the vicarage with a harried expression. He was a stocky man of about 50, with the weathered complexion of one who had spent a lifetime outdoors and hands that bore the indelible marks of agricultural labor. Lavinia, having known him since childhood, stopped to inquire after his welfare. Durwood's face, which had been set in lines of weary irritation, softened slightly. "As well as can be expected, Miss Gray. Thank you for asking. The police have had their questions, and I've given my answers. Straightforward enough, though they seemed reluctant to believe me." "I'm sure it's just routine," said Lavinia soothingly. Durwood's gaze fell on Miss Marple, and Lavinia hastily performed introductions. The former farmer acknowledged them with a brief nod. "You were there when they found him, you understand." "Nasty business. Very distressing," agreed Miss Marple. She regarded him with her clear blue eyes, taking note of the deep lines around his mouth, the slight tremor in his right hand. "I was just admiring your village. The gardens are particularly lovely, even at this time of year." It was a commonplace remark, the sort of thing any elderly lady might say, but it had the curious effect of relaxing Durwood's tense posture. "We've good soil in these parts, heavy but rich. Needs proper handling, mind you." His gnarled hands made an unconscious gesture as if feeling the texture of earth. "Not that it matters to me now. Of course, you must miss your farm," said Miss Marple sympathetically. For a moment, something raw and painful flashed in his eyes. "Miss it? It was my life. 4 generations of Durwoods worked that land. My great-grandfather cleared the West Field with nothing but an axe and a pair of oxen. My father laid the stone walls that border the property, carried each rock by hand." His voice caught. "And now it belongs to a man who—" He stopped abruptly, conscious perhaps of how his words might be interpreted given recent events. "Forgive me," he said stiffly. "I shouldn't speak ill of the dead." "It's perfectly natural to feel attached to a family property," Miss Marple assured him. "My own cottage in St. Mary Mead is quite modest, but I should be most distressed if circumstances forced me to part with it." Durwood seemed about to say more when the church clock struck 11, reminding him of some engagement. With a hasty farewell, he strode away toward the village green. "Poor man," said Lavinia, watching his retreating figure. "They say he's hardly slept since losing the farm. Takes long walks at all hours, according to Martha." She worries terribly about him. His wife? Inquired Miss Marple. Lavinia nodded. Martha Durwood, salt of the earth. She's taken in washing to help make ends meet. As they continued their walk, Miss Marple reflected that James Durwood's hands, though strong and work-roughened, possessed a peculiar stiffness about the joints that reminded her forcibly of old Mr. Hendricks from St. Mary Mead, who had once been accused of writing threatening letters. It had later transpired that poor Mr. Hendricks suffered from such severe arthritis that he could scarcely hold a pen, let alone manage the elegant copperplate of the anonymous notes. Chapter 4. The Doctor's Dilemma. Miss Marple awoke on the third day after the murder with a slight stiffness in her left shoulder that suggested a change in the weather. She lay for a moment, contemplating the pattern of light and shadow cast by the lace curtains onto the ceiling of Lavinia's guest bedroom. In her experience, ailments, however minor, could occasionally be turned to advantage. This particular twinge, she decided, might warrant a visit to the village doctor. After breakfast, she mentioned the discomfort to her goddaughter with just the right mixture of stoicism and concern. Nothing serious, I'm sure, she said, setting down her teacup with delicate precision. But perhaps if it's not too much trouble, I might consult Dr. Creswell. One doesn't like to take chances at my age. Lavinia, who knew her godmother to be remarkably robust despite her fragile appearance, gave her a shrewd glance but merely said, "Of course. I'll telephone for an appointment directly." The surgery occupied the ground floor of a handsome Georgian house on the eastern edge of the village. Its waiting room, while not large, possessed the comfortable shabbiness of a space long dedicated to patient endurance. Miss Marple settled herself in a chair near the window, her knitting bag at her feet and an expression of mild interest on her face. There were only two other patients, an elderly man with a wheezing cough and a young woman with a fractious baby. The latter looked up when Miss Marple entered, offering a tired smile of recognition. "You're staying with Miss Gray, aren't you?" "I'm Alice Collins. I work at the tea shop on Thursdays and Saturdays. How do you do?" said Miss Marple pleasantly. What a beautiful baby. The compliment, though conventional, was sincere. The child, despite its current disgruntlement, had the clear eyes and healthy color that Miss Marple always found appealing in the very young. "She's cutting a tooth," explained Alice, bouncing the infant on her knee. "Dr. Creswell's ever so good with children, not like some." She lowered her voice tone. "He's been ever so kind to everyone since the awful business at Hartley Farm. Especially to poor Mrs. Hartley. Been to see her twice a day, they say." The door to the consulting room opened before Miss Marple could respond to this interesting information. A tall, fair-haired woman in a starched uniform appeared, consulting a clipboard. "Miss Marple?" she called. "The doctor will see you now." The nurse, Nurse Wilson, according to the neat badge pinned to her uniform, led the way down a short corridor. Her manner was brisk and efficient, but Miss Marple noticed a certain tightness around her mouth that suggested suppressed emotion. "A slight shoulder discomfort, is it?" she inquired, showing Miss Marple into the consulting room. "Yes, just here," Miss Marple indicated the spot. "Nothing alarming, I'm sure, but at my age one can't be too careful." "Indeed not," agreed Nurse Wilson, making a brief note on the patient card. "Dr. Creswell will be with you momentarily." Left alone, Miss Marple took the opportunity to observe her surroundings. The room was meticulously tidy, each instrument in its place, each surface gleaming with cleanliness. A row of medical textbooks stood on a shelf behind the desk, their leather bindings well worn but carefully maintained. A single photograph in a silver frame showed a group of young men in medical school regalia, their faces bright with promise and accomplishment. Dr. Edmund Creswell entered with a quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. He was younger than Miss Marple had expected, perhaps 38 or so, with intelligent eyes and the sort of good looks that improve rather than diminish with maturity. His handshake was firm, his manner attentive as he listened to her description of her symptoms. "Just a touch of rheumatism, I expect," he said after a careful examination of her shoulder. "Nothing to be concerned about, though. I'll prescribe something to ease the discomfort. The damp weather we've been having doesn't help, of course." "It has been particularly changeable lately," agreed Miss Marple. "I understand such conditions can exacerbate all manner of complaints. My nephew Raymond, he's a writer, you know, suffers terribly with his bronchitis when the weather turns. His wife Joan is at her wit's end sometimes. Poor thing." It was a characteristic Miss Marple gambit, the seemingly innocent mention of a relative's ailment designed to establish common ground and encourage confidences. Dr. Creswell responded, as most conscientious doctors would, with a few professional observations on the management of chronic bronchial conditions. As he wrote out a prescription, Miss Marple remarked gently, "You must have been kept very busy since the unfortunate events at Hartley Farm. Such a shocking business." A barely perceptible pause in the doctor's pen strokes was the only indication that the subject affected him. "Yes, it has been a difficult time for the village," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Mr. Hartley wasn't well known to many of us, having been here less than a year. But violent death is always distressing to a community." "And to his poor wife," said Miss Marple with just the right note of elderly sympathy. "So young to be widowed. I believe you have been most attentive to her welfare." This time the pause was more pronounced. Dr. Creswell looked up, meeting Miss Marple's guileless blue eyes with a direct gaze of his own. "Mrs. Hartley is my patient," he said quietly, as was her husband. "Of course," murmured Miss Marple. "How thoughtless of me. Professional confidentiality is so important, particularly in such sensitive matters." Something in her tone must have struck a chord, for the doctor's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Hartley was not in the best of health," he said, choosing his words with care. "He had a heart condition that was causing him considerable concern. We had been monitoring it closely for some months." Miss Marple absorbed this information with a slight inclination of her head. How worrying for him. And did Mrs. Hartley share his concerns? Mr. Hartley preferred that his wife not be burdened with the details of his condition. Dr. Creswell's tone was measured, a common choice among men of his generation, though not one I generally advocate. "I believe in transparency between spouses in medical matters." He handed her the prescription with a slight smile. "Take one of these twice daily and try a warm compress on the shoulder before bed. If the discomfort persists, do come back to see me." As Miss Marple gathered her belongings, she noticed a small framed photograph partially hidden behind a stack of medical journals on a side table. It showed a woman, Emily Hartley, unmistakably, seated on a garden bench, her expression unguarded in amament of genuine happiness. The picture had been positioned, Miss Marple noted, where a doctor seated at this desk might glance at it frequently throughout the day. In the waiting room, Nurse Wilson was attempting to soothe the fractious baby, while its mother searched frantically through a large handbag. The scene reminded Miss Marple irresistibly of poor Mrs. Barnaby from Mary Mead, whose husband's terminal diagnosis had been concealed from here until the very end, not out of kindness, as had been claimed, but to prevent her from making certain financial arrangements that would have disadvantaged other interested parties. Chapter 5. The Vicar's Confession. The Church of St. Andrew's in Little, Worthy dated from the 15th century, its weathered stone walls bearing testament to generations of village life. Miss Marple had always found churches interesting, not merely for their architectural features, but for what they revealed about the communities they served. This particular example, With its meticulously maintained churchyard and somewhat haphazard interior arrangements, suggested a parish where tradition and practicality maintained an uneasy alliance. The Church Flowers Committee meeting had been scheduled for 3 o'clock, and Miss Marple, who had been invited to attend by Lavinia, arrived with the punctuality that had been her habit throughout life. She found the small vestry already occupied by 4 ladies of varying ages, all regarding with solemn concentration a list of forthcoming services requiring floral decoration. "Ah, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Prescott, who appeared to have recovered from her shock sufficiently to resume her committee duties. "How kind of you to join us. We were just discussing the church bazaar arrangements. Reverend Blackwood has asked us to coordinate the plant store." Miss Marple murmured, something appropriate about being happy to assist in any way, though her attention was caught by a small accounting ledger that lay open on the vestry table. The column of figures had been meticulously maintained, but a slight discoloration on several pages suggested that tears had fallen upon them in the recent past. The meeting proceeded with the earnest attention to detail that characterizes such gatherings in English villages. There was considerable debate about whether chrysanthemums were appropriate for Remembrance Sunday and a tactful discussion of Mrs. Ellison's tendency to incorporate rather too many gladioli into her arrangements. Regardless of the season, throughout it all, Miss Marple sat with an expression of gentle interest, contributing occasional observations about the flower arrangements at St. Mary Mead, while absorbing every nuance of conversation. It was evident to her practiced eye that something was troubling the committee beyond the usual concerns of floral aesthetics. There was a certain tension in the air, a carefulness in how Reverend Blackwood's name was mentioned. When the meeting concluded with a somewhat subdued agreement to meet again the following week, Miss Marple lingered, expressing an interest in examining the church's medieval font. Mrs. Prescott, with a meaningful glance at her fellow committee members, volunteered to lock up after her. "Such a difficult time for our parish," she said when they were alone, her voice lowered though there was no one to overhear. "First the business with the Church Restoration Fund, and now this dreadful murder. Reverend Blackwood is quite beside himself." "The Restoration Fund?" inquired Miss Marple mildly. Mrs. Prescott glanced toward the vestry door as though fearful of being overheard. "There have been some irregularities," she admitted. "Nothing that can't be put right, I'm sure. But Mr. Hartley had been making rather pointed inquiries. He was on the finance committee, you see. Despite being so new to the village, he had quite a head for figures." "How unfortunate," murmured Miss Marple. "Such matters can be so distressing for everyone concerned." "Indeed," agreed Mrs. Prescott fervently. "Particularly as—" She hesitated, then continued in a rush. "Well, it hardly matters now, but Mr. Hartley had requested a meeting with the Reverend on the very morning he was found about the accounts." Miss Marple absorbed this information with a slight nod. "I imagine the meeting had to be cancelled under the circumstances." "Quite so," said Mrs. Prescott. "Though between ourselves, Miss Marple, the Reverend seemed almost relieved when he heard what had happened." "That sounds terrible, doesn't it? But you didn't see his face when Mr. Hartley first raised questions about the Restoration Fund? I've never seen him so afraid." The sound of footsteps in the church nave interrupted their conversation. Both ladies turned to see Reverend Simon Blackwood approaching, his tall figure silhouetted against the stained glass window behind him. "Mrs. Prescott, Miss Marple," he greeted them with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "I hope the meeting was productive." He was an imposing man of around 60, with the sort of lined, ascetic face one might find in a medieval painting of a saint. His clerical collar, Miss Marple noticed, was slightly askew, and there was an uncharacteristic disarray to his normally well-groomed silver hair. "Most informative," replied Miss Marple. "I was just admiring your church." The medieval features are particularly well preserved. Yes, we're fortunate in that regard, said the vicar. Thought the maintenance of such an old building is a constant challenge. The restoration fund has been something of a godsend. There was a slight emphasis on the last word that struck Miss Marple as defensive, almost challenging. Mrs. Prescott, murmuring something about needing to prepare tea for the Mothers' Union, made a hasty departure. In the quiet that followed, Reverend Blackwood seemed to come to some decision. He gestured toward a pew. "Would you care to sit for a moment, Miss Marple? I understand you have some experience with difficult situations." They settled themselves in the front pew, facing the altar with its arrangement of late autumn berries and foliage. The vicar's hands, clasped tightly in his lap, showed the slight tremor of a man under considerable strain. "I find myself in a position that tests both my faith and my judgment," he began. Mr. Hartley had discovered certain financial irregularities in the church accounts, irregularities for which I am responsible. "I see," said Miss Marple quietly. "Not theft," he added hastily. "Never that, merely reallocation. My wife has been ill for some time, a rare condition requiring treatments not covered by the national health. I borrowed from the restoration fund, intending to replace every penny." "A difficult position indeed," observed Miss Marple. Mr. Hartley discovered the discrepancies almost immediately. He had a remarkable facility with figures. The vicar's voice held a mixture of admiration and resentment. He demanded full repayment by Halloween, threatening to take the matter to the bishop if I failed to comply. "And were you able to meet his deadline?" inquired Miss Marple. "Note entirely. I had arranged a partial repayment and was preparing to negotiate for more time." He passed a hand over his face, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. "And then, well, you know what happened?" "Indeed," said Miss Marple gently. "How very troubling for you." The vicar looked at her directly, his eyes shadowed but resolute. "I have been asked to account for my movements on Halloween night. I told Inspector Morton that I was working late in my study preparing Sunday's sermon. The truth is more complicated." He fell silent, his gaze now fixed on the altar cross. "I was at the hospital in Melchester," he continued finally. "My wife had taken a turn for the worse. I spent the night in the hospital chapel praying for guidance about everything: my wife's health, the missing funds, Mr. Hartley's ultimatum. I didn't mention this to the inspector because there was no one who could verify my presence there. The chapel was empty, and I signed no visitor's book." Miss Marple considered this confession with the careful attention it deserved. It reminded her forcibly of the church warden in St. Mary Mead, Mr. Barnaby, who'd borrowed funds from the parish accounts to pay for his daughter's wedding, fully intending to replace them when his investments matured. The situation had resolved itself without public scandal, though not without considerable private distress. "A position of trust carries heavy responsibilities," she observed, "and sometimes impossible choices." "Yes," said the vicar simply. Whatever Mr. Hartley's faults, and he was not a man who inspired affection, he did not deserve such an end. I have prayed for his soul and for forgiveness of my own moral failings. The afternoon light filtering through the stained glass windows cast patterns of jeweled color across the worn stone floor. In the hushed quiet of the ancient church, Miss Marple reflected that confessions rarely revealed the whole truth, even when the confessor believed himself to be entirely sincere. Chapter 6. Moonlight and Shadows. The tea shop on the high street of Little Worthy boasted windows of leaded glass and an interior of polished oak that spoke of generations of respectable commerce. Miss Marple, seated at a corner table with a pot of dark ginger tea and a slice of Victoria sponge, observed with quiet interest the comings and goings of village life. 4 days had now passed since the discovery of Thomas Hartley's body, and the initial shock had given way to a more sustained fascination. Murder, Miss Marple reflected, was rather like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples continued to spread long after the initial disturbance. "Would you care for more hot water, Miss Marple?" The young woman who addressed her was Alice Collins, whom she had met at Dr. Creswell's surgery. Today she appeared less harassed, her fair hair neatly pinned beneath a small cap, her apron immaculately starched. "Thank you, my dear," said Miss Marple, noting the slight shadows beneath the girl's eyes that suggested a night of limited sleep. "The tea is most refreshing, I must say. You make a particularly light Victoria sponge." Alice's face brightened at the compliment. "That's my own recipe. Well, my grandmother's, really. The trick is to fold in the flour ever so gently." There was a momentary lull in custom, and Alice lingered by the table, unconsciously adjusting the silver locket at her throat. "I understand Inspector Morton has been interviewing young Mr. Sutton again," remarked Miss Marple with the air of one making casual conversation. Such a trying time for everyone involved. A flush of color rose in Alice's cheeks. "Peter had nothing to do with it," she said with sudden vehemence. "Nothing at all." "I'm sure the inspector will establish the truth," said Miss Marple soothingly, "though I understand Mr. Sutton was seen near Hartley Farm on Halloween night." Alice glanced around the empty tea shop, then slid into the chair opposite Miss Marple, her expression a mixture of defiance and distress. "He was with me," she said in a low voice, "the whole evening, from 8 o'clock until nearly midnight. We were in the meadow behind Hartley Farm. There's a little copse there, very private. We often meet there when I finish work." "I see," said Miss Marple gently. "Have you told the inspector this?" A shadow crossed Alice's face. "Not exactly. You see, my father—" She hesitated. "My father is very strict. If he knew I was meeting Peter in secret, especially after dark—" "But surely under the circumstances—" "Father says the Suttons are not respectable," Alice continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "because of Peter's mother running off with that salesman from Reading. And then there was that business about Peter taking things from the farm." "Things?" inquired Miss Marple. "Just odds and ends. A pair of secateurs, some twine, a small bag of fertilizer, nothing valuable." Alice's chin lifted slightly. "Mr. Hartley made such a fuss about it. Called the police and everything, though Constable Rogers said it wasn't worth filing charges. Peter was let go without a reference. It was so unfair. He only took those things because his father's allotment needed them." The bell above the shop door tinkled, announcing the arrival of customers. Alice rose hastily, straightening her apron with nervous fingers. "Please," she said, "if you happen to speak with the inspector, Peter is a good person. He would never harm anyone." The earnestness in her young face touched Miss Marple, who had seen many variations of the same expression over the years. Love's absolute certainty in the face of contrary evidence. It reminded her rather forcibly of young Molly Jackson from St. Mary Mead, who had maintained her sweetheart's innocence in the face of overwhelming evidence, only to be province-erect through a most unexpected circumstance. As Alice returned to her duties, the door opened again to admit Inspector Morton. He acknowledged Miss Marple with a slight nod before selecting a table on the opposite side of the room. His choice, she noted, afforded him a clear view of both the counter and the entrance. Miss Marple's reflections were interrupted by the arrival of Lavinia, slightly breathless from her walk. "There you are, Aunt Jane. I've just come from the police station." "Such a crowd outside?" "They've brought in Peter Sutton again. The most extraordinary rumors are flying about." Miss Marple poured a cup of tea for her goddaughter with steady hands, though her mind was rapidly assimilating this new information. "What sort of rumors?" she inquired. "Well, it seems the autopsy report has finally been completed," said Lavinia, lowering her voice as she glanced toward Inspector Morton's table. Mrs. Henderson's sister is a cleaner at the pathologist's office in Melchester, and she says there's been some confusion about the exact time and cause of death. Indeed. Miss Marple's needle-sharp attention was now fully engaged. What sort of confusion? Lavinia leaned forward, her voice scarcely above a whisper. Apparently, there are indications that Mr. Hartley suffered a heart attack, but there's also clear evidence of the blow to his head. The question seems to be, which came first? This revelation, though murmured in the most discreet fashion, appeared to reach Inspector Morton's keen ears. He rose from his table and approached them with the deliberate tread of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "Miss Gray, Miss Marple." He inclined his head in greeting. "I couldn't help overhearing. The village grapevine appears to be functioning with its usual efficiency." There was a dry note in his voice that suggested resignation rather than annoyance. Inspector Morton acknowledged. Miss Marple with perfect composure. "Won't you join us? I believe Alice has just taken a fresh batch of scones from the oven." Morton hesitated, then seated himself with the air of a man who has decided that informal channels of communication might prove useful. "I understand you've been questioning young Mr. Sutton again," said Miss Marple, pouring him a cup of tea without waiting for his assent. "Such a trying time for everyone concerned." "Routine inquiries," replied the inspector, accepting the tea with a murmured thanks. "Mr. Sutton was observed in the vicinity of Hartley Farm on the night of the murder. His explanation for his presence there is incomplete." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes met the inspector's with a gaze of surprising directness. "I believe," she said carefully, "that Mr. Sutton's account might be more complete if certain personal considerations did not restrain him." The inspector's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Personal considerations? The young are often remarkably foolish about such things," continued Miss Marple, with the air of one making a general observation about human nature. "So concerned about appearances, even when matters of life and death are at stake. It puts one in mind of young Tommy Simpkins from St. Mary Mead, who would rather be suspected of breaking into the church poor box than admit he was meeting the vicar's daughter behind the vestry." Inspector Morton's expression suggested that he was accustomed to Miss Marple's oblique method of conveying information. "And was this Tommy Simpkins in fact guilty of theft?" "Oh, dear me, no," said Miss Marple. "It transpired that he was nowhere near the church at the time in question. As Mr. Sutton, I suspect, was nowhere near the scene of Mr. Hartley's death." The inspector regarded her thoughtfully. "You seem very certain of that." Miss Marple. "Not certain," she corrected gently. "One can never be certain without evidence. But young people in love often choose the most inconvenient moments and locations for their meetings. The meadow behind Hartley Farm, with its small copse of trees, would provide exactly the sort of privacy that a young couple might seek." A flicker of comprehension crossed the inspector's face. He glanced toward the counter where Alice was arranging a fresh tray of scones with careful precision, her hands betraying a slight tremor. "I see," he said slowly. "That would certainly explain Mr. Sutton's reluctance to provide a detailed account of his whereabouts." "The young lady's father is quite strict, I understand," added Miss Marple. "Such considerations can seem overwhelmingly important, even in the face of more serious matters." Inspector Morton drained his teacup and rose to his feet, nodding his thanks. As he approached the counter to pay his bill, he paused to exchange a few words with Alice. The girl's face, at first apprehensive, gradually relaxed into an expression of relief. "Well," said Lavinia, watching this interaction with interest, "I dare say that's one suspect eliminated, though it hardly narrows the field significantly. Half the village seems to have had some grievance against poor Mr. Hartley." Miss Marple folded her napkin with methodical precision, her thoughts turning to the pathologist's report that Lavinia had mentioned. The question of which had come first, the heart attack or the blow to the head struck her as particularly significant. It reminded her in some indefinable way of the case of Mr. Bentley, whose fatal fall down the cellar steps had initially appeared to be a tragic accident until certain peculiarities about the blood spatter had suggested otherwise. Chapter 7. The Widow's Weeds. It is a curious feature of English village life that the social obligations surrounding death are observed with particular exactitude. Regardless of personal feelings, a properly timed condolence call is considered essential, neither too soon, which might suggest unseemly eagerness, nor too late, which could be interpreted as indifference. Miss Marple, whose understanding of such niceties had been perfected over decades, judged that the 5th day after Thomas Hartley's death would be precisely correct for paying her respects to the widow. Hartley Farm presented a different aspect in the clear autumn sunshine than it had on the misty morning of the discovery. The white-painted farmhouse, set back from the lane behind an orderly garden, suggested prosperity and taste. The curtains in the front windows had been partially drawn as a token of mourning, but not so completely as to prevent the occupant from observing visitors' approaches. Miss Marple, attired in her best gray costume with a hat of modest propriety, was admitted by a middle-aged woman, whom she took to be daily help rather than a permanent servant. The drawing room into which she was shown displayed the slightly self-conscious elegance of recent decoration. Chintz-covered chairs arranged with geometric precision and ornaments selected for appearance rather than sentimental value. Miss Marple announced herself with the careful enunciation of one unused to such formality. Emily Hartley rose from an escritoire in the corner, where she had apparently been engaged with correspondence. She was younger than Miss Marple had expected, certainly no more than 40, with a kind of cool blonde prettiness that would, Miss Marple judged, wear well into middle age. Her black dress, while suitably somber, was cut with a fashionable simplicity that subtly emphasized her slender figure. "How kind of you to call," said Mrs. Hartley, extending a well-manicured hand. "You are staying with Miss Gray, I understand." Her voice held the carefully modulated tones of one who has consciously refined a regional accent. It reminded Miss Marple rather forcibly of the new doctor's receptionist in St. Mary Mead, who had worked so diligently to disguise her origins in the less genteel part of Manchester. "Yes, indeed," replied Miss Marple. "Lavinia is my goddaughter. I was so dreadfully sorry to hear of your bereavement. Such a shocking thing to happen." Emily Hartley arranged her features in an expression of appropriate gravity. "Yes, it has been most distressing. The police seem no nearer to finding who was responsible. Inspector Morton calls daily, but his questions grow increasingly repetitive." There was the faintest hint of impatience in her tone, quickly suppressed. She gestured toward a chair. "Won't you sit down? I was just about to ring for tea." The ritual of tea, the delicate cups arranged on a silver tray, the thin slices of lemon, the precisely cut sandwiches, provided a familiar framework for conversation. Miss Marple observed with interest that while the preparations were impeccable, Mrs. Hartley ate and drank nothing herself. "I understand you discovered poor Thomas," said Mrs. Hartley, after the initial courtesies had been observed. "How very dreadful for you." "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple, "though I fear it must have been infinitely more distressing for you." "My dear, such a sudden loss." "Yes." Mrs. Hartley's gaze drifted momentarily toward the window, where the pumpkin patch would be visible from a different angle. "Thomas and I had been married only 3 years. It seems so unfair." There was something in the hesitation before the final word that caught Miss Marple's attention. She had heard many expressions of grief in her long life, and this struck her as lacking a certain authenticity. "Had your husband been troubled by anything recently?" She inquired gently. Sometimes when a tragedy occurs, one looks back and sees signs that all was not well. Emily Hartley's fingers tightened fractionally on her teacup. Thomas was not a man to share his concerns readily. His business affairs were quite complex, and he preferred to handle them privately. "A very traditional attitude," murmured Miss Marple. "My father was much the same. He never discussed financial matters with my mother, which caused her considerable difficulty after his passing." Mrs. Hartley's expression softened slightly at this personal confidence. "Yes, exactly. Men of that generation?" Though Thomas was not elderly, he held rather old-fashioned views about certain things. "I understand he was not in the best of health," ventured Miss Marple, adjusting her lace cuff with careful precision. A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or weariness, crossed the younger woman's face. "What makes you say that?" "Oh, merely an impression I formed," said Miss Marple vaguely. "Something in his appearance, as I recall it." Mrs. Hartley seemed to relax fractionally. Thomas suffered from occasional digestive complaints, nothing serious. The casual dismissal of what Dr. Creswell had described as a significant heart condition struck Miss Marple as notable. Either the widow was being deliberately misleading, or she had indeed been kept in ignorance of her husband's true medical state. "How difficult for you both," she said sympathetically. "My nephew Raymond suffers terribly with his digestion. His wife Joan is most particular about his diet." As she spoke, Miss Marple's gaze wandered innocently about the room, taking in details that others might overlook. The arrangement of photographs on the mantelpiece included several of Emily alone, or with friends, but only one formal portrait of the couple together. There was a faint circular mark on a polished side table where a photograph frame had clearly stood until recently, removed, perhaps because its contents were no longer appropriate to a house of mourning. As Emily turned to pour more tea, Miss Marple's gaze lingered momentarily on the papers at the writing desk. Among them, partially concealed beneath a leather-bound ledger, was what appeared to be a draft of Thomas Hartley's will, dog-eared and creased in a manner suggesting frequent handling. Curious, she thought, that such a document should be so well thumbed when Mrs. Hartley professed such ignorance of her husband's financial affairs. "I expect you will find the farm rather a burden to manage alone," she continued, returning her attention to her hostess. "Oh, I shan't remain here," said Mrs. Hartley with unexpected decisiveness. "Once everything is settled, I intend to move to London. I have friends there, and the country has never really suited me. Such a beautiful property." "Though," observed Miss Marple, with a gesture that encompassed the well-proportioned room and the landscaped garden visible through the window. "Beautiful? Yes, but rather isolated." Emily Hartley's voice held a note of restrained eagerness that belied her widow's weeds. "London offers so many more opportunities." Miss Marple noted with interest that despite Emily Hartley's slender build and refined appearance, her forearms displayed the subtle muscle definition of someone accustomed to more physical activity than her demeanor might suggest. The incongruity reminded her rather forcibly of Miss Henderson from St. Mary Mead, whose delicate appearance belied strength developed through years of managing her brother's farm single-handedly. The conversation drifted to neutral topics: the unseasonably mild weather, the challenges of post-war rationing, the difficulty of finding reliable domestic help. Throughout, Miss Marple maintained an expression of gentle interest, while her mind catalogued a series of small but significant observations. The writing desk where Emily had been seated upon her arrival contained not letters of condolence, as might be expected, but what appeared to be estate documents. A London telephone directory lay open beside them. There was a faint but distinct imprint of soil on the carpet near the French doors that led to the garden, a recent mark given the otherwise immaculate condition of the room, and behind a cushion on the window seat, partially concealed but visible, from Miss Marple's angle, was a gardening glove with the unmistakable residue of pumpkin vine still clinging to its fingers. As Miss Marple rose to take her leave, She noticed a small framed photograph that had fallen behind a bureau, or perhaps been placed there deliberately. It showed Emily Hartley and Dr. Creswell, their heads inclined toward one another with the unmistakable intimacy of more than mere acquaintance. The tarnished silver frame suggested it was not a recent addition to the room's decor. "I must thank you for receiving me," said Miss Marple, gathering her gloves and handbag. "It cannot be easy to entertain visitors at such a difficult time." "Not at all," replied Mrs. Hartley, with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "It's a comfort to speak with someone who understands the complexities of such a situation." As she was shown to the door, Miss Marple paused to admire a vase of late chrysanthemums on the hall table. "How lovely," she remarked. "From your garden?" "Yes," said Mrs. Hartley a fraction too quickly. "The gardener brought them in this morning." But Miss Marple, whose knowledge of horticulture was both extensive and precise, recognized that the blooms had been cut at least 2 days earlier. The slight browning at the edges of the petals was unmistakable to one experienced eye. Walking back toward the village, Miss Marple reflected that Emily Hartley reminded her forcibly of Mrs. Barnett from St. Mary Mead, who had gone to such elaborate lengths to establish her presence at the Women's Institute on the afternoon when her husband's rare coin collection mysteriously disappeared. Mrs. Barnett, too, had been meticulous about creating evidence of normal activities, even to the point of arranging flowers, while carefully concealing her actual movements during the critical period. The gardening glove hidden behind the cushion seemed particularly significant in this context, suggesting a desire to obscure some interaction with the pumpkin patch that had nothing to do with floral arrangements. Epilogue: the Scarecrow's Secret. The drawing room at Miss Gray's cottage presented a cozy scene on that November evening. A small fire crackled pleasantly in the grate, casting a warm glow over the assembled company. Inspector Morton stood with his back to the mantelpiece, while Miss Gray dispensed sherry from a decanter that had belonged to her grandmother. Dr. Creswell occupied an armchair near the window, his expression guarded. Emily Hartley, still in her widow's black but with a certain restrained elegance about her appearance, sat rather stiffly on the sofa, and Miss Marple, her knitting needles moving with gentle rhythm, completed the gathering. It had been a week since Thomas Hartley's body had been discovered in the pumpkin patch, and the village of Little Worthy remained in a state of subdued excitement. Various theories had been proposed and discarded. Suspicion had flourished and withered. Now, at Inspector Morton's request, this curious assembly had been convened. "I must thank you for agreeing to this rather informal meeting," the inspector began, addressing the room at large, but with a particular glance toward Miss Marple. "I believe we may be approaching a resolution to our investigation." Emily Hartley set down her sherry glass with a small, decisive movement. "Have you arrested someone, Inspector?" "James Durwood, perhaps?" There was an eagerness in her tone that struck Miss Marple as rather inappropriate for a recently bereaved widow. The knitting needles continued their steady rhythm. "No, Mrs. Hartley," replied the inspector. "Mr. Durwood has been eliminated from our inquiries. His arthritis is quite severe. He would have found it physically impossible to wield the garden spade with sufficient force." A slight color rose in Emily Hartley's cheeks. "Then surely it must have been that Sutton boy. Everyone knows he had a grievance against Thomas." "Peter Sutton has an alibi for the time of death," said Inspector Morton. "A rather convincing one, in fact." "The vicar, then?" suggested Emily, with an edge of impatience. "Thomas had discovered his embezzlement of church funds." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Oh dear," she murmured. "That does remind me so much of Mr. Bentley from St. Mary Mead. Such a similar situation in many ways." Inspector Morton turned toward her with an expression of polite inquiry. "In what ways similar, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, folding her hands in her lap with the composure of one accustomed to being heard. Mr. Bentley died at the foot of his cellar stairs, she began. A most unfortunate accident, or so it appeared initially. He had fallen and struck his head on the stone floor. There was blood, but not quite as much as one might have expected from such a wound. You see, Mr. Bentley had, in fact, suffered a fatal heart attack while descending the stairs. He was quite dead before his head struck the floor. Emily Hartley shifted in her seat, a slight frown creasing her forehead. I fail to see the relevance of this story to my husband's murder. The relevance, Mrs. Hartley, said Inspector Morton quietly, lies in the pathologist's findings. Your husband suffered a massive heart attack on the night he died. The head wound was inflicted after death, not before. A charged silence filled the room. Dr. Creswell's face had grown pale, his knuckles white where they gripped the arm of his chair. The final report came in this morning, continued the inspector. Most conclusive. There was minimal bleeding from the head wound, consistent with injury after death. The heart attack was the primary cause. Emily Hartley's composure wavered for only a moment before she gathered herself. But that's absurd. If Thomas died of natural causes, who would have struck him afterwards? It makes no sense. On the contrary, said Miss Marple gently, it makes perfect sense, if one considers the terms of your husband's will. All eyes turned to her. The elderly spinster adjusted her lace collar with fingers that showed no tremor. I happened to have a most enlightening conversation with Mr. Jenkins yesterday, she continued, with the air of one relating a fortuitous coincidence rather than a carefully orchestrated encounter. Such an unusual clause in Mr. Hartley's will, stipulating that in the event of his death by violence or accident, the entire estate would pass not to his wife, but to a charitable foundation. Most revealing of his state of mind, it thought. Emily Hartley's face had grown very still. How could you possibly know the terms of my husband's will? The solicitor was quite forthcoming in his way, replied Miss Marple. And then there was the copy I observed among your papers yesterday, rather well thumbed for a document you profess to know nothing about. Inspector Morton stepped forward. We believe, Mrs. Hartley, that you discovered your husband's body in the pumpkin patch late on. Halloween night, he had gone to check for damage. After the village children's customary pranks, finding him already dead from natural causes, you saw an opportunity, or perhaps a necessity, given the terms of the will. You arranged the scene, continued Miss Marple, her voice gentle but inexorable. The garden spade, the dramatically positioned scarecrow, a theatrical tableau designed to suggest murder rather than natural death. You can't prove any of this, said Emily Hartley, but her voice lacked conviction. The soil traces on your drawing-room carpet, said Miss Marple. The gardening glove. Your convenient ignorance of your husband's heart condition, despite Dr. Creswell being your particular friend. Dr. Creswell rose abruptly. I never told her, he said hoarsely. Thomas insisted on keeping it from her. I respected patient confidentiality. Emily Hartley's composure finally crumbled. I found him there, just lying among the pumpkins. At first I thought he was playing some ridiculous joke, and then I realized he was dead. Her hands twisted in her lap, the knuckles white with tension. 6 months ago I was dusting his study, though he always kept it locked when he was away. The drawer to his desk had been left open, and I saw the will. So you were aware of the clause regarding death by violence or accident, said Inspector Morton quietly. Yes. The word emerged as barely a whisper. I never knew I'd read it. All those years of marriage to a controlling, suspicious man, and I would be left with nothing if anything untoward happened to him. When I found him dead in the pumpkin patch, all I could think was that this was my one chance. A natural death meant I would inherit everything. The confession, once begun, poured forth with a kind of desperate relief. She described finding her husband's body, the moment of realization. the hasty construction of a murder scene. The garden wheelbarrow was just behind the tool shed, Emily continued, her voice now oddly detached. I used it to move him back to where I found him after I'd struck him with the spade. The scarecrow was the difficult part. Its frame was heavier than I expected, but Thomas had always underestimated what I was capable of. The scarecrow had been her most inspired touch, she admitted, a theatrical element to distract from the inconsistencies. As Inspector Morton led Emily Hartley away, Dr. Creswell lingered, his face a study in conflicted emotions. I never suspected, he said to Miss Marple. Not for a moment. We see what we expect to see, replied Miss Marple with gentle understanding. And when one is in love, expectations can be particularly misleading. The scarecrow was a rather theatrical touch, observed Miss Marple, after Emily had been led away. Quite deliberate in its symbolism, I imagine. Dr. Creswell looked puzzled. Symbolism? Oh, yes, said Miss Marple. In the village, scarecrows serve a dual purpose, you see. They protect the harvest, certainly, but they also stand as silent judges, watchful guardians that see everything yet say nothing, rather like the village itself, with its appearance of tranquility masking all manner of secrets. I believe Mrs. Hartley positioned it as a kind of shield, not merely against garden predators, but against the judgment she feared would follow her actions. A curious choice considering how effectively it drew attention to what she most wished to conceal. Later, as Miss Marple and Lavinia sat alone before the dying fire, Lavinia shook her head in wonderment. How did you know, Aunt Jane? What made you suspect Emily rather than any of the others? Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the soft click of needles punctuating her words. Human nature is remarkably consistent, my dear. When someone creates an elaborate facade, there is nearly always something being concealed behind it. Emily's performance, as the grieving widow, was just a fraction too perfect, like Mrs. Barnett's flower arrangements that were meant to establish her presence. At home when she was in fact elsewhere? She paused, her needles momentarily still. The truly sad thing is that her deception was unnecessary. Had she left things as they were, a natural death, she would have inherited everything. It was only by trying to conceal the truth that she lost everything. Lavinia sighed. I suppose that's often the way. The cover-up proves more damaging than the original event. Indeed, agreed Miss Marple, though in this case the original event was no crime at all, merely the unfortunate but natural end of a human life. It was fear and opportunism that transformed it into something far darker. Outside the window, the last leaves of autumn drifted from the trees, golden in the light of the setting sun. In Little Worthy, life would gradually return to its usual rhythms. The pumpkin patch at Hartley Farm would be plowed under, the earth made ready for spring planting, and the scarecrow, that silent witness to human folly and mute guardian of hidden truths, would be dismantled and forgotten until the next growing season brought need of its watchful presence once again. A reminder that in English villages nothing truly remains hidden forever, however carefully one arranges the appearance of things. Thank you for listening to The Pumpkin Patch Murder. Here on Café Tales, Miss Marple reminds us that even the quietest corners of the countryside can hide secrets waiting to be unearthed, and the truth, once uncovered, can never be buried again. If you enjoyed this mystery, please subscribe for more detective tales and share this story with fellow lovers of intrigue. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and may your evenings always be filled with good stories and warm company. This is Ailey signing off from Café Tales.